Programs and Director of the Integrated Development Program, for a welcoming message. Dr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Isabel, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Happy to see you all connected to this seminar. Welcome to the special seminar series, Scenarios for the Future, How to Create Value in the New Normal. As of May 2020, CIMMYT organized several webinars for CIMMYT colleagues as part of a series of talks with international experts to inspire a scenario building process, and we constructed some scenarios for 2025 with input from you all, an exercise with the management committee also, and those will be soon launched and be available also publicly. And you will be happy to know that Michael, as part of our Knowledge Systems for Sustainability Consortium, looking at the nexus food, water, and energy, also looked at the scenarios and gave his input. And that's why we thought it would be good to have him today also as a speaker, as he is not only a fantastic colleague, but also a great scientist who always has thought-provoking ideas. This is all part of CIMMYT's 3 steps response to today's COVID crisis. First of all, we have to deliver our ongoing projects, which you are all doing day after day. But also we have to look what CIMMYT can contribute to mitigate the impact on the food system of all measures taken to control the pandemic. And last but not least, but probably much more important even, is to shape the future, to generate a transformational response on how we can construct a better future after this disruption. So therefore, Michael Obersteiner, as director of the Environmental Change Institute of nothing less than the University of Oxford, will present today a special seminar called Global Land Sparing, Producing the Same on half of the land at half of the cost. Michael is the director of the Environmental Institute of the University of Oxford. His research experience stretches from biophysical modeling in the areas of sustainable agriculture, ecosystem management to economics, finance, integrated assessment, and he works for the ECI's research teams. He joined the institute coming from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, where we got to know Michael as the director of the Ecosystem Services and Management Program, and set up several collaborations that are still going on with IIASA. Under his leadership, national and international organizations have received science-based policy advice using quantitative modeling techniques. He's a highly cited researcher, and some of you may know actually also an excellent yodeler, but that's for another time and story. If you want to know about that, that's for when we can meet again over a beer or over a nice soft drink, I can tell you that story. Michael, over to you.
Yes. Well, there will be no live yodeling today, but thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the kind invitation. As you mentioned already in your introductory words, I was doing a lot of scenario analysis, and I think I could actually present you some of the scenarios which are quite close to which you were constructing as well. However, what's quite interesting is having done these scenarios for a long time, we never really looked at scenarios in their extreme. And this is actually the purpose of this talk now, where I will show you some extreme scenarios of global land sparing, because this gives us a little bit of a let's say new perspective of what can in principle happen and what's in principle possible. So I was myself actually really astounded when we crunched this number, that we could actually replicate the FAO Global Food Basket for 2015 with just half of the cropland. And currently we are doing the analysis of cropland and pasture land. And when we calculated the implied costs, we also were really astounded that it's actually at a significant lower cost. Mostly because when we look at the literature of agricultural production, food security via, prices as we calculate the number of hungry people according to FAO methodology. There was always this trade-off between food production and environment. And however, with this analysis, we can actually debunk this myth and actually say there's a synergy between at least land sparing and half cost. Whether or not land sparing is really sustainable in a holistic sense, that's another question, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion on this. But let me first really go and start a little broader in the presentation, and really come up with some larger figures. You all know them, but it's just good to know, to repeat them over and over again. And I intentionally didn't take a narrower definition of the agricultural sector, but call it the nature sector. The nature sector is really a giant, and we have this number from the World Economic Forum that 50% of global GDP is actually related directly to nature. But also when we just look even at advanced economies like France, the food sector in the larger definition, not agriculture in itself, the food sector is actually responsible in that country for about 36% of GDP. And this includes then, the restaurants, the R&D sector, INRA, and so forth. But also, agriculture is the largest employer on earth. Its direct employment is estimated, according to various sources, to either a little bit over, a little bit below 1 billion. But if you take then the associated household dependence into account, we actually get up to 2.5 billion people who are directly dependent, and in this case, not on the nature sector, but on agriculture. But at the same time, it's also associated with non-nice issues, just like it's the largest source of child labor, for example. But then when it comes to the environmental accounts, you all know the AFOLU sector, 23% of greenhouse gases. But then at the same time, the land use sector overall is a huge source of negative emissions, quite significant. And then, of course, now with the COVID crisis, the biodiversity issue and the decline of biodiversity becomes more and more of an issue, since we know that this zoonotic disease is actually directly or indirectly related to biodiversity destruction. And this was actually anticipated already in the, again, World Economic Forum global risk landscape, which I show here. And so if we want to fix the overall sustainability problem, it's fixing the food system is really a necessary condition, absolute necessary condition, simply because of the size of the environmental issues, but also social issues that are associated with agricultural production. And when you go into it, also to my own surprise, because I thought this debate is long thought out, is we are coming more and more into the fringes of this dispute, I would say, between land sharing and land sparing. And here I just put up an illustrative figure from the RSPB. So when we look at land sharing, I just put up here one example. It's a very recent study by IDRI on agroecology, an ambitious systemic project, which is actually doing analysis in this case for France, but also European Union, and in particular also lately they came up with a report for the UK, and it became very prominently featured in the media as well, and is heavily discussed. And what it basically asks for is that it's about abandoning pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, looking into redeployment of extensive grassland production of mainly beef. And when you look at the analysis a little deeper, it implies eating overall less meat on the consumption side. But if you eat meat, then you should eat red meat. And when we take this debate to global levels, we have this ecological critique, which is also ancient in a way. But here I've just put up the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where modern agriculture is kind of accused for the decline of ecological services through monocultures. And there's an entire package of social justice issues associated with this discourse, also in a way ideologically rooted in social movements and so forth. You know this all. And then more on the kind of land-sparing side, you have the techno-economic or techno-productivist approach, which is mostly has been led by economists, and more recently also revitalized in view of the food and food price crisis, where people come up again and ask for a stronger role of modern agriculture, modern meaning also industrial agriculture, and its role as a growth engine. And I'll come back to that a little more. And then more lately, we see also quite a few of the kind of green techno-productivists who actually ask for land sparing. And here we'll come back to the consumption side. Land sparing, if it's done well, then of course you also eat less meat, but in this case you would actually eat more white meat rather than red meat, because red meat takes way more land away. So here you also have, even on the consumption side, in these two philosophies, directly opposing recommendations on what you should eat, not only on the production side, which is quite interesting to observe. And just putting a little bit more meat on this economist view is it's basically the farm sector is viewed as traditional, backward, low productivity associated with poverty. You have lots of uneducated, unskilled workforce, unorganized and informal markets. And what you want to have is you want to have a migration of labor into the non-farm sector to actually get the economy going. And in exchange, you give more technological impacts and knowledge back to the kind of backwardish farm sector. That's kind of the paradigmic view of economic development under the Washington Consensus. And then you hear, we need more research and technological progress, more education, infrastructure, market growth, and you have it. And of course, the literature, the academic literature is also full of these kind of things in the agroeconomics discourse, the development economics literature, the new structural economics, and the neoclassical growth theory. But the neoclassical growth theory also suggests that there should be, in the end, a convergence. And some of that convergence we actually see in the sense of, and you also know this, I'm just repeating and trying to motivate the land sharing and land sparing issues. So what you see over time is that share of agriculture employment is declining and has been declining historically quite rapidly, and of course the share of value added. And in the end, it all gravitates towards something what the North American and the European OECD countries do. And there's an additional issue associated with it, and this is here you see this bubble figure where you have the economy-wide labor productivity on the x-axis, and the ratio between agricultural labor productivity and non-agricultural labor productivity. So basically the rural urban divide in terms of income. And what you see is that in the end, the OECD countries, to the right upper corner, you actually see more of a parity close to 1. However, you see the masses of people and the masses of agricultural production is actually concentrated to the left, where there is huge disparity, income disparity between rural and urban incomes. And as people or economies develop, there's a breaking point, and this is kind of this U shape. And this is a little bit of the scary bit when you go through the numbers. How many people would actually go through this breaking point, and how quickly would they be available to a global job markets where there might actually not be so much absorptive capacity. But that's something we'll discuss more later on. But now let me get really into the heart of these more extreme analysis. So what we did is we did land-sparing scenarios. And it basically, what we did is we ask ourselves, what if we produced crops with the best available technology everywhere, and just allow the best production to come into the market? And this is exactly the definition of the MLS, the maximum land-sparing scenario. And I have highlighted this in this green box. What we also did is we did a little bit of an emulation of I would call weak land sharing scenario, where and this is called the targeted land sparing scenario, where we assumed that where there is current crop production, we still maintain a share of at least 20% of that production. Because in the maximum land sparing, what's happening is that you locate the production only in the best places, and you give up agriculture in the places that are not so productive. So with this targeted land sparing, we actually get a more even distribution of production globally. Just as a methodological background, we use a global biophysical crop model. We use the EPIC model. Many of you might actually know it. It's basically driven by soil information, management information, and climate information. And it produces not only yield outputs, production outputs, but also a whole set of environmental indicators ranging from, nutrient balances, greenhouse gas balances, and so forth. So what we basically did is, this is a field scale model, and we implemented it on global scales with a whole lot of input data sets, which is illustrated here. And here you see kind of more the computational setup of the different databases that come in. But these are technical details, and we might talk about this later on. What we also did more recently, and I know there's something similarly going on at CIMMYT or the CGR overall, is where we also are now looking more and more into machine learning emulators of either crop models as we did it, but then also assimilating in information from crop trials, from real observations, in order to improve the prediction capability and the predictive skill of these crop and crop yield forecasting models. So what do we get out of this modeling? What we get is, we call this a hypercube of production possibility sets. Here's an illustration along different intensification gradients. Intensification, in this case, irrigation intensity and nitrogen fertilization. And these are then the inputs to an optimization model for the land-sparing scenario. For the targeted land-sparing scenario, the TLR, which I mentioned before, we also excluded areas which are of high priority for biodiversity, carbon or water. So we actually gave them priority to places which are less important for these issues. So here we get to the first result. So on the left, you see the stacked bar of the different crops we modeled and the associated cropland area. And in the middle bar is the result for the maximum land-sparing scenario. And then to the right, you see the output of the targeted land-sparing scenario. And what was really amazing to us was to see that if we were in a scenario of global land sparing, we would basically need half of today's cropland to still produce the same amount of what we produce in this case in 2015. The other surprise was that if we have this targeted land sparing, the results are not so much dissimilar. So in a way, here the conclusion is a little bit, it doesn't really matter too much on where you do the land sparing. Most important is that you actually close the yield gaps, and overall on a global level, there's a huge potential to save a lot of land. When we look into the other environmental impacts of these two scenarios, to the left again, the maximum land sparing, and the other one, the targeted land sparing, we see that in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus requirements, we actually get about the same amount as if we were in the business as usual scenario. One thing is, of course, we apply in this case more fertilizers to the fields which are still in production compared to the business as usual. However, with the overall land sparing, the multiplication between hectares and the inputs gets us approximately to the same amount. The shading here is just the difference between the different assumptions of whether we allow crop residues to be incorporated in the soil again, or whether they are removed. On irrigation, we were quite surprised. We see a lot of potential for saving irrigation water in these scenarios, and of course in the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. There's also quite a lot of saving there. And what's also quite interesting is that the carbon loss to natural vegetation is much lower. That's fine. I will not comment on the habitat loss here. We are still doing additional work where we look more really at the landscape level to better understand the overall implications of land sparing. So much to the kind of biophysical results. So basically, half of the title is now already presented. The other half is what are the cost implications. And what we did here is we built And it took us now something like 4 years to build a techno-economic cost accounting model. It's really a bottom-up construction where we have kind of an engineering type of model where we have detailed description of the field costs, the farm costs, and the infrastructure costs. What we currently don't account for are the costs of land. So basically the land rents and the lease rents. We can calculate it kind of artificially, but the observations are not there yet. But the overall share is not that much that it would actually impact our results too much. And so what we do here, we basically construct a geography of different production costs, and we construct supply schedules. And when we calculate now the costs, and here we have these 10 different crops which we were currently able to model out for the costs, we see again a quite significant reduction in the overall production cost of the land sparing scenario, and as well the targeted land sparing scenario. So here the orders of magnitudes are very similar as the biophysical results. We also see that there is quite a lot of heterogeneity in geography of whether or not we see a local increase in production or even a cost reduction in this field. So here there is not a uniform kind of picture emerging. When we construct these global supply curves based on this geographic information, we also see a quite differentiated picture on for the different crops and commodities, of course. However, overall, what we can see is that, of course, that the cost for business as usual is typically much larger than for the targeted land sparing, and of course the maximum land sparing almost always appears as the least cost production schedule, but not necessarily, and we actually don't fully understand why this is really the case. What's also quite interesting is in the maximum land sparing, the supply schedules also become much flatter, which means also and reinforces this previous insight that it doesn't really matter also for economic outcomes where you actually do the land sparing. And there are many knock-on implications of these flat supply curves. One would be, and I just put this here, is that you would also see less overall volatility to aggregate weather shocks, for example, on aggregate outcomes, even though you would see more concentration of production globally. What we also did is, and that's not in the title, is we calculated how many farmers or farm laborers would we actually need in a maximum land sparing scenario. And the calculation currently is about 20 million farmers, which is a tiny fraction of the current farmer population, which is also quite an interesting thought. It's theoretical, so to say. However, it gives you an appreciation or an insight of what's in principle possible if we were farming globally as we are farming in Europe and let's say in North America. If we now were to implement such a land sparing scenario, what would we come up in terms of policy conclusions? And I'm not saying that we should actually do that, but this is the hypothetical cases. First of all, it would be, how do we incentivize so many farmers today to produce accordingly? And knowing that many of them will actually go out of business. And how would we actually deal then with the issue of exiting farmers simply because global prices would drop so much? The other issue is really, if we were to implement this, there is so much lack of data, information, and knowledge to do that. And how can we actually cater this best and such a transition towards catering for better biophysical and social heterogeneity? And of course, if we were to introduce such kind of policies, then we would actually talk about micro-targeting and micro-incentivizing and really pick out the ones who are the winners and the best producers, so to say. And of course, here would be huge amounts of transition risks, also especially on the social side. The other issue which and this is the last point, which we didn't calculate yet, is what if we also change the consumption basket, and if we assume that diets would improve in the sense of less environmental impact and probably less health impacts, what we know the result would approximately be is we would spare another 1/3 of both costs and land as well. So here we can bring these scenarios to quite unimaginable extremes, so to say, which, however, are biophysically possible. What we did not do in this analysis, and this is mostly due to knowledge gaps, data gaps, and probably the enormous amount of heterogeneity that would be associated with such kind of analysis, is how can we construct a competing land sharing scenario that actually does justice to the details that are necessary to carry it out? And here I just put in one publication that recently came out, and which kind of talks against a little bit against our results, is here you have this higher yields and more biodiversity on smaller farms. And the data this study gathered would be highly interesting, but it's simply not sufficient to carry out a true land sharing scenario, which I hope maybe in cooperation with you guys we can put out in let's say a year or two from now. So now this brings me to the conclusion of my talk. And first of all, I would like to kind of restate one insight from this analysis, is that the long-term business as usual pathway is actually along this techno-economic land-sparing narrative, simply because when you look at the farm economics, we definitely see economies of scale, and we see economies of scope to some degree. And what we also see in the market currently ongoing, that we have horizontal and vertical integration along the entire supply chain, from input industry all the way to supermarket chains. So here, you know, if there is no proactive policy intervention, the natural underlying forces and economics of the farm and food business is actually going towards this techno-economic scenario, I would claim, but I'm up for discussion on this one. And therefore, this will be many controversies around this development have to be struck, and the controversies I would see is actually less on the environment and kind of food security dimension, I see the big controversies which are looming already, but probably not so prominent, at least in the academic literature, is really on the social consequences of such scenarios. And if you remember the bubble diagram, there are lots and lots of people that would be affected by a global land sparing, re-incentivation with masses of millions of people exiting the farming sector rather quickly. Then as a third point, and this is an observation, is, when we talk about land sparing versus land sharing, there's no clear winner here in reality. It's always highly contextual and really also scale dependent. And it's, whether or not you should do in a particular landscape land sparing or land sharing, or a combination of the two. It really depends on the natural diversity of the landscape. Just think about the diversity of foodscapes in Mexico versus a diversity of foodscapes in the plains of the US. But then there's also, there's a social political context and of course technology dynamics. And if you look at some of the new food technologies that come along, they might also have quite disruptive effects on some of the current production systems. And then finally, the final point is this land sparing and land sharing. It seems kind of a technical dispute, but when you look at it more deeper and you dig deeper into the literature, you actually see it's really loaded with a lot of historical baggage on ideology. And I would basically invite you to engage in a research cooperation where we actually try to debunk some of these ideological controversies and bring more evidence to the debate, and probably enrich some of the results I was showing to you today. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation. I'm really looking forward to some hopefully a little bit provocative comments on what I presented today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michael Oberstein. We would like to invite our audience, if you would like to raise your hand for a comment or any question that you would like to make to our special speaker of today. Very interesting presentation. Because we are inviting our, okay, here we are. Here we have one question coming from Victor Comerel. Victor, would you like, okay, I will read the question. Could this case hypothesis be a CGR-ECI contribution to UNFSS Summit 20 Big Ideas?
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. But I think we would have to still work a little bit on a definition of a land sharing, competing land sharing scenario. I think currently it's, for us at least, it's easy to produce the land sparing scenario. And we are kind of promoting this discourse now, simply because we can technically do these calculations. But what really breaks my heart a little bit is that we cannot currently do a decent land sharing scenario where we can also exemplify and put numbers to the benefits or disbenefits of a land sharing scenario. And when you look at the literature at the moment, there is more bias towards the land sparing narrative, but I'm not sure whether I'm believing it.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the microphone to Gideon Krusman, who has a question, and then we can invite Olaf Arenstein after this question. Gideon, please.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
Hi, Gideon.
It was a very nice presentation. Yeah, I decided to raise my hand instead of putting it into the chat because it's a little bit complicated. The story that you're telling is really about, let's say, the helicopter view of what is happening at landscape levels. So this is really important because that tells a very important part of the story. There's also that component which is about the decision making at farm household level, and this is where it is about the goals and aspirations of individuals and of households, and the key components of that decision making process, which in general, in agriculture, is very much about managing risk while trying to attain some key objective, whether it's income or food security or profit. That's really a little bit context specific, dependent on the types of markets you're in. The way that you can offset some of the other risks that you're facing, and that really drives that kind of decision making drives technology choice, and hence is a really important component of the land sharing versus land sparing, whether that makes sense, and that feeds back into that example that you were giving at the end, where you said, there is context specificity, especially if you look at something like Mexico and the Great Plains in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, it's quite interesting when you look at because what we have is we have a field scale biophysical model and a field scale economic model where we calculate costs of different, let's say, intensification options. And what we see is that for many fields, so to say, globally, it doesn't make sense for them individually to go to land sparing because it's a little more costly. And so it's really, in order to get land sparing on a larger scale, it's really, you need policy intervention to coordinate it. However, once you trigger it, and this is what we see, is then the kind of the marginal differences of the effects of the farm are actually quite small, so to say. There's only, exactly factors you were mentioning, risk, propensity, and these kind of things could actually switch a lot the outcomes of kind of the collective outcome versus the logic of the individual producer. And so here in this study, this is also interesting to see that yes, we have justification and understanding. Why do we see business as usual as it is today? And why don't we get to land sparing? Simply because there's not this coordination mechanism in place such that individual decision making could actually lead to this, in our case, superior outcome. Superior under quotes, of course. And so basically the insight is it's a policy choice what we want, and of course land sparing would only work globally, and in this sense you actually would have to coordinate nation states in order to get global land sparing going in an effective manner. And we know how politically this is feasible or not feasible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. I would like to invite Dr. Olaf Reinstein, please.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. 3 comments/questions. One, in in the cartwheel you presented, so you looked at some of the environmental impacts, fertilizer use, water use, and CO2 and other gases. But one of the externalities of intensive agriculture, and so you were alluding to that, there were even water savings. There was slightly higher fertilizer use, slightly higher, this one, slightly higher P&N use, less water use, but I mean the quality aspect is a key consideration in terms of externality of intensive agriculture, and I was kind of missing that. I mean, that's one of the huge areas that CIMMYT is grappling with. How can you intensify sustainably? So yes, we know you can increase yields by throwing on more and using the best land, but how can you actually do that sustainably? And so the whole water quality, land quality, air quality considerations I was a bit missing in this consideration. And this is kind of, you seem to idealize industrial intensive agriculture as a way forward. So yes, you can save land, but to what environmental cost? And a bit beyond them, the ones that you have picked up here in terms of the environmental indicators. The second point, and you do raise it, is the social cost. So indeed, you can concentrate the land on few large farms. I mean, that's what has been happening in the global north. And the social cost of basically putting all the smallholders and family farms out of production is going to be huge. And so I would really like to see if you would disaggregate. I mean, you allude to it a bit in your conclusions, but if you disaggregate this, the global north versus the global south. And so in the global north, this is basically already has been happening, although you still say you see some opportunities to also have to look at some social implications in OECD countries, etc. But even OECD, of course, is diverse from Mexico all the way to the Great Plains. But I would really encourage you to also have a look at the social cost, because I would expect the social cost in terms of farmers having to leave because of land sparing is going to be significantly less in the global north versus the global south. And so you may want to think differently how you then handle this transition, because again, that's the whole agricultural development process. How do we actually enable people to retain livelihoods and keep a living without just dumping them out of agriculture? And then the final comment is, you also alluded to it, changes in the food system, be it in terms of diets, be it in terms of processing value chains. There could also be huge changes happening there. And again, I would see that as a critical factor. So yes, land sparing is one thing, but then again, looking at how diets are transformed, what are really the options, what are the implications, because that would also have big implications in terms of what we actually want to use. Mm-hmm. But overall, thanks so much for the thought-provoking. And you presented a lot of information in slides, so we're still digesting. But overall, I do think these three areas is areas that probably merit some further consideration. Thanks. Over to you, Mike.
Yes. Thank you for those comments. Well, on the environmental externalities, I think here I would really love to see collaboration with you guys to help us improve on that kind of analysis. We just identified now a global data set on pesticide use. So that's a dimension we would like to add to this, and then also try to see whether we can do an appropriate analysis for biodiversity impacts, and probably also DALI type of impacts on pesticide use. That's one issue. The other thing, I think, related to the quality, it's not only environmental quality, but also the quality of the food itself. And the nutritional issues, because we know that from heavily intensified crop production. There are certain diseases associated with it, and so forth. But the evidence is also not that strong on those sides. But I think the nutritional aspects are really, really important as well. And so here, the analysis is in a way incomplete and poor, and I'm a little bit scared that people take messages out of such analysis at face value. It's an academic piece and it's incomplete, and therefore I would really be highly alerted if people draw conclusions on policies too quickly. Simply because many of the aspects are not part of it, and we really need to get a more holistic picture of the entire impacts of this. On the social side, I think this really scares me the most, and this is when you look at historically what happened, for example, to Europe. We were lucky with the kind of the intensification waves. We were lucky in the sense that we could export labor to North America, South America, and other parts of the world. And we had at that time huge amount of labor scarcity in the upcoming industrial sector. However, when you look at economies like India, for example, we have a completely different situation at the moment, where we don't have these safety valves in the sense of exporting people or a vibrant economy that would absorb a lot of rural labor. And we don't even have the infrastructure, because at that time, after World War II, there were proactive programs to get, young farmer daughters and sons into university, prepare them for the new economy. In many of these developing economies, we don't even have this infrastructure to actually transition the labor force, so to say, into a 21st century economy. And if we see now, these pressures coming from the agricultural production sector itself, the economies of scale, which is kind of a fundamental law of production, and see this play out. And when you just look at, field size in India, this is just barely at the minimum of economic existence. So this system will break sooner or later, and you will see larger field sizes, more mechanization, and so forth. And it's almost predictable that we will see social hardship and the associated consequences. This is a predictable crisis, I would say. We somehow need to prepare for, but no one sees it. And this is really a puzzle to me. That when you look at this figure, which I got from Bruno Dorin, you just see, where is it? This one. This one. Here you actually see this is masses of people going close to a breaking point. And it's and there's historical analysis and whatnot. There's huge amounts of evidence, and of course, I don't know, China, for example, it's a command control economy. They have proactive programs to relocate people from the rural areas into skyscrapers in the cities. This is a kind of a planned scheme, but many other countries don't do this at all. And I think this is a big problem and a big challenge. Yes, and for your third point, yes, I guess the food system view is fundamental to this, and this integration, as you mentioned, with diets, consumption behavior. If we start to integrate these kind of things into the picture, is also very revealing, and I would say would even reinforce the analysis. Also, more going, and here I put my intentional provocative bias into it. So when we look, for example, the spreading of supermarketization in sub-Saharan Africa, what's the consequence for this on the agricultural sector? It's again, more the industrial type of production, because here you have then the compliance to the food safety standards and all of these kind of things, which all go more and more into the direction of this one paradigm. So I see a lot of drivers that are bringing us into this new future where some of the large consequences are predictable today. And again, we don't really prepare well for this.
Not enough.
Not
Thanks.
enough.
To be continued.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Then we have a little time for one more question, maybe. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. And there's one question here that says, is there direct correlation between a small farm and biodiversity? If so, how about large farm?
Well, this refers to this analysis, which I actually didn't conduct, and it's a literature review by the Ramankuti lab at UBC in Vancouver. So here they actually did find a correlation between higher biodiversity on smaller farms. And I would say, this is kind of, and I would subscribe to the basic insight and the evidence. However, if you incentivize large farmers to produce biodiversity with financial incentives, they will also produce it. Just simply currently, they don't produce it simply because they don't have an incentive to. But, there's no technical or economic reason why a larger farm should not be able to produce biodiversity values if they're incentivized to do so.
Thank you so much. There is one more, maybe we can just very quickly. In the land saving, there are some crops that are not considered. Will that affect the modeling?
What we did is we included the rest of the crops, and we had kind of the same assumptions on the land sparing share, so to say. If we leave it constant, so we basically don't assume any land sparing, simply because we have about 80% of global production with the crops we analyzed here, not on the cost side, but on the biophysical side, the results would not change. They would only change very marginally.
Sorry, my microphone was muted, sorry. Do you have any final comments? So we are about to close the session of today.
I have only one comment, and this is, I would be delighted to see some collaboration ongoing, especially on trying to put more meat on the land sharing scenario. So if we could engage in some kind of fruitful collaboration, that would be awesome.
Thank you so much. So thank you very much for our special speaker, Dr. Michael Oberstein, Director of the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford, who has presented the special seminar, Global Land Sparing, Producing the Same on Half of the Land at Half Cost. Very interesting, very challenging presentation, and we look forward for a very strong collaboration with you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the audience.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks. Bye-bye. Stay in
Bye.
touch.
Bye-bye.